Okay. All right, so there are slow and mundane seasons that we go through. And these seasons might seem dull and boring because of our daily routines, which are mainly consist of school, work, and sleep. But there are, what is it? But there are things, I wrote this intro like this morning because I didn't know I had to have an intro. I'm talking about seasons today. And there are things in these seasons of dull routine and repetitive work that you get lost in. You're not seeing things in these seasons. You don't see how the seemingly small things that you're doing now are preparing you for your calling. And it's typically in this age range and in this season that you hear your calling. But the calling has to find you first. Like Elisha, when he was working in his father's field, that's when Elijah came and found him. He called him. He was looking for an apprentice, for another prophet to replace him. The messenger of your calling is looking for you in fields, working, but might not be able to find you because you may have decided to pull a late night on the ball field, or he's looking for you among the workers, but can't find you because you're binge watching a Netflix show that you probably don't even have business watching anyways. This isn't a holiness lesson. I just wanted to get that in. All right. So I've thought a lot about my calling and how serious it is compared to how serious I actually treat it. I'm sure that, I read the Bible on average, and I pray 2 hours a day, but I was spending 5 hours a day on social media. I've been thinking about great people in the Bible and throughout history and what they've spent their time doing. And I began to think about the early Romans before they were ever an empire, and I researched what their training routine was like for their soldiers. And I found out that they had weapons training every single morning. And they would spar and fight each other with shields and swords that were twice as heavy as the shields and swords that they would carry into battle. And after weapons training, they had to march for miles carrying those practice weapons, plus a bag with twice the amount of supplies that they were required to carry on marches. And they did all of this because they didn't know what enemies were beyond the mountains. They couldn't predict what was on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea that they wanted to conquer. So they pretty much were landlocked. They were isolated. So they decided that they wanted to be prepared. Before they started campaigning, they were training. Thank you. Two more, brother. One, brother. Two. So these Romans were pretty much so isolated. They didn't know too much about the outside world. So when they started training, they had no way to gauge their strength because there was no one to compare themselves to. So just imagine how strong you could be if you stopped comparing yourselves to others, kept your head down and trained for the conquest, and in our case, prepared for your calling. Now, I'm not saying to settle and be satisfied with who you are and stop growing. What I mean is, imagine if the bar wasn't already set. If the bar wasn't already set, then how would you approach your calling after that? How far would you take it? I remember a couple months ago, I was running at the gym, and this is when God gave me this message. I was running, and I just kept thinking about how hard I was running and how much work I was putting in, but I was still just not going anywhere. I was still on this treadmill, and I stood there. Well, I didn't stand there. I ran there. And I thought about how this was the perfect analogy for my life. How I was working, giving everything I have to one thing, but still going nowhere. But then that's when God gave me this message, and he reminded me about the Romans. How they wanted to conquer the sea and see what was on the other side, but they didn't have any boats. So what they did was they enlisted a navy, they hired builders, but it took months for the builders to construct a fleet of ships. So as the builders were building, the navy was training. But how could the navy train without any boats? Well, here's what they did. They set out 2 rows of benches, had a drummer in the back and a commander in the front, and they did this on land. And while the commander was giving orders, the soldiers were rowing. And for hours a day and for months, they practiced rowing, this boring, repetitive rowing. Their season of preparation for their calling was literally wake up, row, and sleep. And it felt no different than what most of us are going through right now. Your schedule is school, work, and sleep. And church seems like it's slowly becoming something you just attend out of habit. It's too easy to get lost in the rowing of this life. It's too easy to get lost in work and in school and to forget what it's all about. It's too easy to get so lost in the repetitive rowing that you forget about the sea. It's too easy to get lost in the rowing that you forget about your calling. Like the Romans, when you're trying to achieve greatness, you're going to have to prepare for that greatness. Because there are enemies you have yet to face. There are callings you have yet to hear. And this mundane season that you might find yourself in, where you feel trapped in your hometown or chained to a desk, just might be a season of preparation where God is calling you, where God is preparing you for callings that you have not yet heard. The choices you make now and the things you do routinely now are preparing you for either a future of fulfillment or unfulfillment. Callings heard or callings missed and passed on to someone that is better than you. And that's not me being harsh. That's what Samuel told Saul when he said, "The Lord hath rent the kingdom from thee this day, and hath given it to thy neighbor that is better than thou." Samuel said, your calling is going to someone else that is more willing to obey God after Saul had disobeyed God. In the book of Esther, when the Israelites were about to be killed by the king, Mordecai, Esther's uncle, said to Esther, he said, "Don't think that because you are in the king's house that you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, maybe you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Mordecai was saying, Esther, if you don't save us now, if you don't save us, then relief and deliverance is going to come from another place. God is just going to use someone else. But right now, Esther, you have the opportunity. You have the chance to be used of God. And who knows, maybe all the preparation you went through was for this exact moment. Maybe God was preparing you for this calling. Your purpose can find you in the midst of your preparation when you don't even know what you're preparing for. In 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse number 1, it says, "And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, saying, I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil, and go, and I will send you to the house of Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons." So Samuel gathered all of what he thought was Jesse's sons together into the house. And while everybody was in that house being examined by Samuel, David was still in the fields. And when Samuel rejected all the sons, he asked Jesse if this was all of his sons, and Jesse said, "No, there's one more." He said, "No, there is one more. He's out in the fields tending to the sheep." And they sent for David so Samuel could see him, and when they met, Samuel anointed David and called him the new king of Israel. David was so caught up in the shepherd's field that the messenger of his calling literally had to seek him out. That being said, while you're in the field, this season of isolation and service, your calling is looking for you. If you would just busy yourself in good work and in the kingdom, your calling is eventually going to find you out. Your calling, it can come in the form of a conviction to serve. You can have a burden. You can see a need and fill a need. A man of God can deliver the call, or God will just speak to you himself. But what happens the day after you're called? Well, like David, most people find themselves right back in the field the very next day. The man of God has left. The calling is now with you. The anointing is now with you, and the man of God has left. So you find yourself right back in the field where you started, having an anointing and having a calling. Because you can be called but not developed. So the shepherd's field is this season where God shapes your character with isolation, because who you are when you're alone says more about you than who you are in public. Because you are your most vulnerable when you're alone. And God uses that vulnerability. God uses that vulnerability to reveal beasts in your life. And these are beasts that wouldn't attack you in group settings. These are beasts that want to pick away at your inheritance one sheep at a time. Thank you.
Great job.
So, now when David went to King Saul and he said, I can slay this giant because I have slain lions and bears that attacked my sheep. No one saw David slay the lion and the bear because he did that job alone every day for hours. David had the faith to slay giants in public because he first slew beasts in private. David could slay giants abroad because he first slew beasts that were closer to home. You're left alone so that you'll face temptation and learn to overcome it. There are beasts at home and in your mind that need to be slain during this season because the giant is an imminent threat. The giant is going to be there eventually after hyphen and after youth. You're left alone because this season is crucial and you have to get these next few years right because playing catch up on your walk with God gets harder and harder as you leave this season, as you leave the youth group and the hyphen group and move upstairs. We've had nearly entire youth groups backslide once they've graduated, got married, or had kids because when Goliath came, they weren't prepared. Because when they went through the season of the shepherd's field, they never slew the lion of lust or the bear of guilt, and rather let the beast pick away at their flock one by one until there was no longer an inheritance left for them. But the lion was never going to kill them. The bear was never going to kill them. They died spiritually because Goliath doesn't care about sheep. He doesn't want to keep you in church so long as you're bound by these other beasts. Goliath wants to finish you. The giant that you faced after youth and hyphen wants to make sure you never go to church again. So in this season of isolation, God is giving you more free time to study and to pray than you're ever going to have the rest of your life. The beasts you slay now are going to prepare you for the giant that you will face later. And just like David, just like everyone here, David was a young person, and he spent the majority of his days learning, working, and serving. But yet he found time to pray and worship with his heart and write psalms while working the fields. So whether you realize it or not, in this season of preparation, in this season of the shepherd's field, the things you learn in this season will have the biggest impact on the battlefield of your calling. For example, when David slung stones, we know that he spent years slinging stones and killing beasts and all these things. And some believe that God guided those smooth stones at Goliath's forehead as David slung them. But that's a good statement of faith, but wouldn't that theory discredit the years that David spent in the shepherd's field slinging stones, killing lions and bears? Now, I'm not saying that God doesn't deserve the credit for this victory, but I am saying and believe that God allowed David to take the skills that he learned in the shepherd's field and use them in the battlefield of his calling. David spent years in fields tending to sheep. He spent years slinging stones and learning how to maintain a herd. You might be asking God to give you qualities and skills that you think the person you're called to be should have. You're saying, God, make me a leader. God, make me a prayer warrior. Well, God's not going to just make you a prayer warrior. What he's going to do is he's going to clear up your schedule once you've prayed to become a prayer warrior, and he's going to give you the grace to become that prayer warrior. But then after that, it's up to you if you're going to spend that God-given time on 5 hours of Instagram like I did, or reading the Bible and praying and fasting. You can't be a leader until there's someone that is willing to follow. Because leader is not a character trait, it's a position. But love, zeal, respect, and strength are characteristics of a good leader. And those are things you're learning now. Every day that you're on time for work, you build respect. When you care for someone hurting, you're developing compassion. And when you fight beasts, you're showing your zeal. But when you actually slay the beast and defeat it, when you defeat the lion of lust and the bear of guilt, you're showing your strength. God is not going to give you skills and character traits that you're not willing to fight for and obtain on your own. Notice how God always said he would give the Israelites the promised land. He said he would always give them the promised land, but what he really did was give them victory in battle, and that in turn gave them their promised land. They still had to prove that they were willing to fight for the promises of God. Now, David could have crossed his arms and refused to be a shepherd, having been called a king. But had David not spent years in the shepherd's field, he would have not been ready for the battlefield. Some of you, every day, you're submitting to authority, working and praying in the fields, wondering what all of it is for. But all those years you spend in the field progressively prepare you for callings and giants that you never saw coming. Years of submitting to authority, being a shepherd, protecting something weaker than himself, and being isolated for hours a day with nothing to do but pray and slay the beast attacking his inheritance. Unbeknownst to David, all of this had prepared him to be the king of Israel. All of this prepared David to become a man after God's own heart. How David led, cared, and fought for those sheep was symbolic of how he would lead, care, and fight for the kingdom of God. If you would just be faithful and give everything you have to the least of things, God is going to make you a ruler over many and in your calling. Every day that you're on time to work and do your best, give all you have to the choir, lead a youth group, or love your family. God sees that as faithfulness. Why would God ever trust you with a ministry if you don't even take the job you have seriously? If you don't give everything you have to the job that actually pays you, why would he ever just give you a ministry? The little things you do matter, and everything you do in this season matters. But what if you're not in the shepherd's field, but rather in Egypt? A season of bondage where you know it is the stepping stone to the promised land. So, the Israelites, they had to go through 400 years of slavery. But had they never entered Egypt when Jacob and his family did, they would have starved during the famine where they lived. God used Egypt as the incubator to facilitate Israel's growth, because had they not been protected and preserved as slaves in bondage for those 400 years by the most successful nation at the time, they wouldn't have grown as fast as they did. Now hear me out. There are 3 things that a nation needs in order to grow rapidly, and that's food, water, and walls, as in like protection from the enemy. In the wilderness, there was famine and no protection from the enemy. But in Egypt, despite the hardship and the pain, there was food, water, preservation, and protection. At first, Jacob didn't want to go to Egypt, but God came to him one night and said, "Fear not, for there will I make of thee a great nation." Y'all can laugh at that. Y'all can laugh at that. Amen. Amen.
Preach. Preach on.
He said food, water, and then
He said food, water.
Okay, so at first, Jacob didn't want to go to Egypt, but God said, "Fear not, for there will I make you a great nation." Notice how God said, "There will I make of thee a great nation." So Jacob was still holding on because he was fearing. He was still holding on to the promised land, but God was saying, "You're not big enough to sustain it or even begin fighting for that promise. Right now, it's just you, your 12 sons, and their families. So I'm going to place you in an environment for a season that will preserve you and accelerate your growth. You might have some growing to do before you can fully possess that promised land." So God can use bondage as protection to keep you from promises you're not ready for, that you're not ready to sustain, promises that you're not yet mature for. You'll be called and anointed and find yourself isolated, working in a field like David, or you'll be slaving away at an unfulfilling, soul-crushing job, putting yourself through college, waiting for this deliverance to finally come. But unbeknownst to you, while you were reading the Bible on break, praying silently at your desk, or leaving the break room to pray even louder in your car, all of this was making you grow. All of it was making you grow, but not move. It was devotion, but not distance. See, it's easy to feel trapped in the shepherd's field or hopeless in Egypt. But if you don't read this season right and prematurely run away from the fences of the shepherd's field or slip out of the chains keeping you from the promise, you won't make it very far, because Goliath is right outside those fences and famine is beyond the length of those chains. See, we've messed up our perception of what growth really is, because we see all these people on Instagram making moves without knowing how much they've really grown. You'll see how far they've gone without seeing how deep they are. You'll see 100 posts of someone preaching before you'll see one post of them reading and studying, because preparation isn't as appealing as the promise. And that's why many ministries die, because we have confused distance as growth and length as depth. What would have happened to those Romans had they got on those boats and started sailing without the proper amount of training? Well, they wouldn't have made it very far, and probably wouldn't have made it back to the shore, back to safety. But if you're worried about deliverance, whenever it's going to come, if you're wondering how long you're going to have to stay in this season, then just listen to this. Pharaoh saw the Israelites one day. He walked out and he said, there's too many of them. It's been 400 years now and they've multiplied so much. So in order to prevent an uprising, because there's so many of them now, there might as well be a great nation. Let's kill the firstborn baby son of each household and do a population control. And so they did this, but it was in this time that Moses was born. And he was sent down the Nile into Pharaoh's house, and later God sends Moses back to deliver his people. Isn't it interesting how when Israel's population was bursting at the seams, and when there was no more room for growth, that's when God allowed deliverance to be birthed. The moment they outgrew Egypt was the moment that God provided a way out of Egypt. In this season, I take comfort in knowing that God won't deliver me until I'm able to sustain the promises and callings that he has for me. Now, this message sounds good now, but it won't sound good 20 years from now if you've remained... It won't sound good 20 years from now if you've remained the small shepherd boy holding on to a calling and slinging stones, feeling captive to the shepherd's field. When God had planned for you to elevate yourself and leave and move yourself and become a mighty man or woman of valor. In 20 years, you're going to call me a liar if you haven't made it out of the shepherd's field, if you haven't progressed, to which I would reply and ask, have you sought and grasped opportunities that would have taken you from shepherd boy to man or woman of valor? Like David, have you ever left the sheep to go fellowship with some warriors? Have you ever left the shepherd's field and took a step of faith onto a battlefield? Have you ever put yourself in a position where failure was not an option, where success was your only means of escape? Have you ever done something just because you knew it was the right thing to do according to your faith and the word of God? See, because God never told David to slay Goliath. In that entire chapter, God did not speak. So when Saul said to David, you cannot fight him because you're a youth and him a man of war from his youth, David said, look, I've spent years preparing for a moment like this to present itself to me. I have the calling and now I have the opportunity. I've slain lions and bears in the season of the shepherd's field, and I believe that this Philistine will be as one of them. David took the first chance he got to elevate himself, to leave the shepherd's field, but he only got to elevate himself by choosing to face something he's never faced before. So if you ever wish to escape the shepherd's field, you have to be willing to walk onto a battlefield. And little did you know that the wolves, the lion, and the bear were all progressively preparing you for the giant. Like David and Esther, your moment may not present itself with an audible voice confirmation from heaven, but instead a gut feeling based on convictions, then solidified by your faith and confirmed by your leadership. See, first, David had a conviction. He said, who is this that defies the armies of the living God? He noticed that something wasn't right. Second, David ran it by his faith and he said, well, I've slain lions and bears. Surely God would deliver this Philistine to me. So second, David ran it by his faith, and he said, I've slain lions and bears. Surely God will deliver this Philistine to me. So someone that didn't hear God tell him to act upon an opportunity, to take a chance, first had a conviction, then his faith gave him the courage to take the opportunity, but then the leadership in David's life, Saul, had to give him the permission to go through with it. You can have a conviction, feel justified in it, and have the faith, but if the pastor in your life doesn't okay it, simply put, you can't do it. No matter how noble and glorious the cause or the move is, without confirmation from your pastor, the pastor that God has placed in your life, you could end up defeated. Thirsty.
The Navajo war dance.
I don't know what's going on there.
It doesn't sound too good.
So, let's go home.
Sorry, it's distracting. It is.
More so I get with a shake. Did you just judge that baby's rattling?
Yes. It's
Get
annoying.
your turtleneck out of here.
No. I like my turtleneck. Talk about my turtleneck.
Oh, I'm joking, Morris.
It's okay.
Okay.
What have you got against turtles?
Oh, I'm gonna preach on. Okay. Collect. Okay. So, next. I believe that when David slew Goliath, he was just setting the standards for the leader that he was called to be, for the king that he was called to be. David made up in his mind that he wanted to be a leader before he was a king. David was a shepherd before he was a commander, fought giants before he was a soldier, ministered before he was in ministry. Too many people want to be preachers but not ministers. They want to preach and not take the work and reach. They want to lead a service but not be a servant. In this season of the Shepherd's Field, you need to make up in your mind what kind of leader you're going to be. Decide how you're going to act, the standards you will hold, the example you want to be, and the legacy you're going to leave. And from here on out, every decision you make must be okayed by your calling. Every decision you make must be okayed by your calling. I remember when I was younger, I wanted to be an X-ray tech. Yeah. When I was younger, I wanted to be an X-ray tech because I was like, man, that's a lot of money, okay? Because I just wanted to make a lot of money when I grew up. It's the only thing I wanted to do was just chase a career and do that. But then after God gave me this calling, He fought me and said, you can't have this career and this ministry. You can only be good at one thing, and you need to choose right now. And so I dropped all those aspirations, and then I stopped caring about school. Yeah, and I was like, okay, I don't need A's anymore. I'll make C's.
There you go.
C's for Christ. Anyways. But one of the hardest things I had to do was sacrifice playing music. Because at the age of 16, God began dealing with me about how much time I spent playing piano. Because I was spending 4 hours a day playing piano, but only about 30 minutes to an hour reading my Bible and actually praying. And so I decided that I had to make a choice, and there was no compromising. I couldn't just play less piano and read more Bible, because then I would just be mediocre with both. So if I was going to be good at something, I wanted to be good at preaching, and I'm still not good at that. But I decided to leave the piano to someone else who has the actual call into the music ministry. So I packed up the piano in the closet. I sold the piano stand to Jonah, and then I went out and I bought a desk for $20 at a yard sale. So it was hard killing one passion so that another could thrive, throwing away something I loved for years for something I just met. Because for 3 years, that piano felt like it was everything that I did, because I was doing it for the majority of my day. But something can be harmless in nature, but without moderation can kill your calling by suffocation, by not giving it enough time to breathe because you were too focused on other passions. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse number 12, it says, all things are lawful unto me. This is Paul speaking. He says, all things are lawful unto me, but not all things are expedient. All things are lawful unto me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. And so Jerry Jones explains this verse in his book, We Preach, and he says, the power to dominate us doesn't always come from things that are sinful or addictive in themselves, but from allowing them to consume our lives, hobbies, sports, social media, and all the interests that consume our time and fill our thoughts must be tightly controlled and kept in their place, or they will spiral out of control. Moderation in all earthly things is a worthy creed. Stand with me.